I'd like to dedicate whatever learning we're going to do today to the memory of my 4 grandparents and my aunt who were murdered by the Nazis, and hope that it will add to a bit of Ilui Neshama for them. I envision this being about a 1-hour webinar, and I'm going to try to take questions in the middle and at the end. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them down in the chat, and I'll be checking that about halfway through and at the end as well. So, July 22nd, 1942, Erev Tisha B'Av. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, Erev Tisha B'Av in 1942 was especially important. And I want to start with Adam Chernyakov. Adam Chernyakov was a chemical engineer. He had been part of the Kehillah leadership of the Jewish community of Warsaw. And when the Nazis invaded September 1st, 1939, in Warsaw, as well as in many other Jewish communities, the leadership of the communities often fled. They fled, first of all, because they were fleeing for their lives, because they assumed, and often it was true, that the Nazis' first victims would often be the leaders of the community, the rabbis, the communal leaders, the leaders of the Kehillah. And in Warsaw, it actually was the case that the leader of the Kehillah fled. And the Germans turned to Adam Chernyakov to organize the Judenrat, the Jewish Council in Warsaw. He had been a part of the Kehillah leadership. And the Germans order him to establish a Jewish council of 24 members. On the one hand, Adam Chernyakov was not at all charismatic. He had no real following because he wasn't a member of one of the major political parties that made up Jewish life in Warsaw. His Yiddish was not very good. Like other Judenrat leaders elsewhere, Chernyakov is put in a very difficult, that's an understatement, in an impossible position. Between a rock and a hard place is actually an understatement as well. The leaders of the Judenrat, those who weren't totally corrupt, and there were some who were, sadly. The leaders of the Judenrat were, on the one hand, for the most part, trying to help their communities to weather the terrible storm of the Nazi occupation. Again, many, not all. Some were just corrupt and collaborators. On the other hand, they were not given the resources to be able to really do something, and they lived constantly under the threat of the Nazis. Chernyakov was blamed by many in the ghetto for the fact that the ghetto police were corrupt and often brutal, the Jewish police in the ghetto, for which the Judenrat was responsible. He was viewed by many as a collaborator because, after all, he implemented many of the decrees of the Nazis. On the other hand, Chernyakov did not flee. Not only did he not flee, Chernyakov actually does not personally gain from the position that he held. There's somebody who's not muted. Please make sure you're muted.
Bernice.
It could be that somebody is on twice, and that's what's causing this. If you're on two addresses, please close one.
David, can't you mute everybody?
Yes, but give me a moment to see if I can get there. Yes, I've muted everybody. Okay. Okay. Come back to Adam Chernyakov. Chernyakov doesn't flee. Chernyakov doesn't personally gain from his position. In fact, he tries hard under impossible circumstances to improve ghetto life, setting up medical clinics, soup kitchens, tries to negotiate with the Nazis for more food, for more freedom in the ghetto. Twice, he's beaten by his Nazi bosses. His diary, which we have, reveals his personal suffering, the headaches he suffered, the pressures, and his sense of responsibility. Chernyakov did not believe the rumors that were rife in the ghetto that the Nazis intended to murder all of the Jews.
Excuse me, David, what is at the beginning of the thing, Warsaw Ghetto, or like toward the middle or towards the end?
I'm sorry. I can't take questions right now, okay?
I'm sorry.
Everybody is supposed to be muted. In the middle, I will take questions, and at the end as well. Okay, so Professor Raoul Hilberg, who wrote the first important academic history of the Shoah, called The Destruction of the European Jews, it came out in 1961, cites 4 stages in the destruction of Polish Jewry. I humbly add a 5th, especially from before the ghetto period of just random terror and forced labor. His 4 stages, as many of you have heard me say, but this is good chazara: concentration, confiscation, weakening, and deportation. Concentration, the establishment of the ghetto in Warsaw, the largest of the ghettos, leads to a population of almost 500,000 Jews, 450,000 Jews, in an area that was only 2.5% of the city. And the ghetto probably accounted for about 40% of the city's population. I've read that the level of concentration of people in the ghetto was 10 times that of the rest of the city. We know from the German records that the average number of people who lived in one room, not one apartment, one room, was about 7. Confiscation, the confiscation of Jewish businesses, real estate, bank accounts, stock holdings, factories, shops, and in the winter of 1941, furs, as well as, of course, radios, automobiles. This, of course, led to a tremendous physical weakening, as well as material weakening. The vast majority of Jews in the ghetto were impoverished. And we estimate that somewhere between 80 and 90,000 Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto from starvation and disease. Yet, amazingly, on Erev Tisha B'Av 1942, a year and a half into the ghetto period, and about 2 years, actually a little more than 2 years, about 2.5 years into the Nazi occupation, the vast majority of the ghetto is still alive. Again, it's more than a year and a half that people are living in these horrible conditions, and the death toll is enormous, and yet about 80% of the ghetto is somehow still alive. Until the 4th stage, deportation. And the great deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto begin on Erev Tisha B'Av, July 22nd, 1942. That is 78 years ago, in just a couple of days on the Hebrew calendar, and a few days ago on the secular calendar. The vast majority of the Warsaw Ghetto will be killed in those deportations, close to 300,000, including those who were killed in the ghetto as the roundups take place. The ghetto had been established in 1940, and the conditions of the ghetto we've described a little bit. We're not going to focus on more of it, but just looking at this picture of the bridge connecting two parts of the ghetto, you could see how crowded the ghetto was. Not only inside, with an average of about 7 people in a room, but outside as well. And of course, the starvation and disease. Adam Chernyakov gets the order as the head of the Judenrat in the Warsaw Ghetto to deliver about 6,000 Jews a day to the Umschlagplatz, to the loading platform where they will be sent to Treblinka. And he writes in his diary, "They are demanding that I kill the children of my people with my own hands. There is nothing for me to do but die." Adam Chernyakov takes poison and commits suicide on July 23rd, Tisha B'Av, 1942. This was the final entry in his diary. I want to stop here to see if there are questions.
You just answered my question about Chernyakov. Thank you, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry for interrupting you before.
Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing. Okay. Okay. Okay, if there are no questions, we're going to continue, and we will stop later for more questions. How did the diary survive? Thank you, Marilene, for asking that question. The diary survives because of the work of Emanuel Ringelblum and about 60 other Jews from Warsaw who formed what was called the Onyx Shabbos archival group. It was really a remarkable effort, the largest archival effort in the Shoah. They not only had the head of the Judenrat, Adam Chernyakov's diary, they had the minutes of all of the Judenrat meetings. They had other diaries from people living in the ghetto. They did research studies. They collected everything from candy wrappers in the ghetto to programs of children's productions, concerts. They ran poetry writing contests for teenagers so they could write about their experiences. All of this was designed to make sure that there would be a record of the Jewish experience, and not only the Nazis would write the history of the ghetto. The most important book on Emanuel Ringelblum and his Onyx Shabbos group was written by Professor Sam Kassow, called Who Will Write Our History? I highly recommend it. Question about Adam Chernyakov's language. He spoke Polish. I'm guessing he also spoke German. Most educated Jews in Poland, certainly those with university degrees, also knew at least some German, if not well. Bernie Rubin points out medical schools as well. There was a medical school established in the ghetto. Just imagine for a moment how many Jewish doctors were in the ghetto, how many Jewish medical students and teachers in medical schools were in the ghetto. And so there was a medical school set up, and Bernie on our trip gave us all a report on that, he being a doctor himself. Miriam Ofer has written a book about the medical clinics and medical care in the ghetto. It was written in Hebrew, but it's coming out in English. It may have just come out. Her name is Ofer, O-F-E-R, perhaps O-F-F-E-R. And she just recently gave a Yad Vashem Zoom on a Zoom lecture on this topic. She's really the expert on that topic right now. Okay, so we're going to return to our story. And I'm providing you with this map just to remind us of the original, partition of Poland in the beginning of World War II. There were 3 partitions of Poland in the late 1700s, but the Nazis and the Soviet Union divided Poland in September 1939. The Germans took the blue section, the western side of Poland and central Poland, and the Soviets took the eastern part of Poland. This will change on June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans will launch Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And of course, the first part of the Soviet Union that they will invade and conquer is Eastern Poland. And it's really with the invasion of the Soviet Union, June 1941, that the final solution really begins. And here we can see a remarkable statistic, which actually parallels what I was talking about in the Warsaw Ghetto. This is from Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men. This is how he starts his book. And I remember when I read it for the first time, I literally did a double take. In March 1942, this is 2.5 years into World War II, 75 to 80% of all the victims of the Shoah were still alive. 2.5 years into the Nazi occupation of Europe. February 1943, meaning less than a year later, 75 to 80% of all victims of the Shoah have already been killed. It literally takes my breath away. This is in large part due to what the Nazis called Operation Reinhard. Operation Reinhard was the Nazi campaign to destroy Polish Jewry. It was named in honor of Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich was the second in command of the SS, in charge of the security department. He was Himmler's right-hand man. And he was also in charge of Bohemia and Moravia, more or less Czechoslovakia. And he was killed by Czech partisans. It was Reinhard Heydrich who called together the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, and he chaired that infamous meeting. After Heydrich is killed by those partisans, the Germans decide that the best way to honor him would be to carry out his plans. And the destruction of Polish Jewry took on his name, Operation Reinhard. Within that time period that we saw before, it's March to February, there's an Israeli professor, a mathematician actually, professor of mathematics, who published an article about a year ago in which he did a mathematical study of the transports to the death camps. He concluded that if this juxtaposition of so many people being killed in such a short time isn't enough, he says there was a hyper-intensive period during this 11-month period from July 1942 until October 1942. In those 3 or 4 months, he claims 1.5 million Jews were murdered, a quarter of all of the victims of the Shoah in 3 or 4 months. So this is a very intensive period. This July to October period is precisely the period of the great deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto, when almost 300,000 of those 1.5 million victims were coming from one city, from one location. Many of you came with me to Poland, and we talked there about Operation Reinhard, the 3 Reinhard camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. And many of you I took to Treblinka, and today I want to focus on Belzec as a case study and take a look at this one particular death camp. Construction begins in November 1941. About 6 months after the launching of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And after some experiments on groups of Jews in gas chambers that were powered by captured Soviet tank engines, that took place in February 1942, Belzec opens up fully in March of 1942. It's in operation from March of 1942 to December of 1942, period of 9 months. That's it. In those 9 months, the Nazis managed to murder anywhere from 500,000 to 600,000 Jews in this one location. After Auschwitz and Treblinka, there's no other place on earth, except for battlefields, where so many people have died in such a short period, were killed in such a short period of time. As far as our family can tell, my 2 grandmothers were among those 500,000 or 600,000 Jews who were murdered in Belzec. There was a frightening efficiency about Belzec, about all of the Reinhard camps, but our study today is about Belzec. There were 14 German guards and 90 Ukrainian guards. That's all it took. About 100 men, only 14 of them German, in order to murder 500,000 or more people. The size of Belzec was that of 1 or 2 football fields. I saw one source that claimed that it was 848 square feet. It sounds too little to me, so I don't want to claim that. But certainly we're talking about a very small area and a very small number of men who are in charge of this death camp. Jews would arrive in boxcars, long trains, about 100 on average in every boxcar, with 40 to 60 cars in a train. 20 cars would be unloaded at a time, meaning about 2,000 Jews would be unloaded at a time. After the horrible hours or sometimes days in that boxcar, in which there were always those who died even before arriving. Once they arrived, they're pulled out. They're told they're in a transit camp, and they need to be disinfected and showered before moving on to a labor camp in the east, because the Nazis pretended and tried to convince people they were being resettled in the east to a labor camp. And by the way, we don't know for sure how many Jews believed them and how many Jews doubted them. It's really impossible for us to know in a scientific way. But we do know that some Jews didn't believe them, some Jews did believe them, and my guess is that many people didn't know what to believe. They didn't know whether to believe the rumors or not. It made no sense to take a slave labor pool and not put them in a labor camp, but rather murder them. It was unprecedented to murder so many women and children. The men and women were separated. They're told to strip naked because after all, they're going to be showered and disinfected. At first, the process takes 3 to 4 hours for those 6,000 Jews on average who arrived on a train. the Nazis continually tweak and perfect the system till they get it down to 1.5 hours. That's all it took. A small area, 14 German guards and about 90 Ukrainian guards. And in 1.5 hours, they had murdered 6,000 people. Raoul Hilberg wrote famously in his book, The Destruction of the European Jews, a man would arrive at a death camp like Belzec or Treblinka or Sobibor in the morning. By afternoon, his body was being burnt, and by evening, his clothing and other possessions were being sent back on a train to Germany. That was a death camp. That was Belzec. The camp closes in December of 1942 because they've accomplished their mission. Almost all of Galician Jewry is dead. Because Belzec was the place where the Jews of Galicia were murdered. From Lvov, from Krakow, from Lublin, and other parts of Galicia. Here we can see the Belzec Memorial today. It's all artistic. All of this rubble that you see here is all part of the art. Nothing remains. The Nazis destroyed the camp because Holocaust denial began during the Holocaust. In fact, in Belzec, unlike in Treblinka, they didn't burn the bodies immediately. They buried them in mass graves. In late 42 and early 43, they had Jewish slave laborers dig up the bodies and burn them in order to destroy the evidence. And what you see in the artistic memorial is a series of names of towns and cities. This is taken from the records of the Polish National Railroad, which has the records of the transports that were brought to Belzec with their date. And so one walks along and sees each town, each city. Sometimes you see a town more than once. My parents' hometown of Brody, the ghetto was deported in 2 separate actions to Belzec. And so it appears twice. Krakow, Lublin appear more than once as well. Only 2 Jews survived Belzec. Here we could see another picture of the memorial. This is a path, and this wall that you could see in the background, the white wall, is where we believe the gas chambers were. The reason I say we believe is that there had to be an archaeological dig done at Belzec because there were so few survivors. Unlike Treblinka and Sobibor, the other 2 Reinhardt camps, where there was an uprising and Jews escaped, and some of them managed to survive the war and testify and help us draw maps of what the camp looked like. In Belzec, there were only 2 survivors. One of them died in 1946 before testifying or writing. The other one, Rudolf Rieder, managed to testify, and his testimony was put out in a short book. But we know less about Belzec than we know about Treblinka and Sobibor because there were so few who survived. I chose the title, The Eve of Destruction, Erev Tisha B'Av in the Warsaw Ghetto and Operation Reinhard, in part inspired by the dating, Erev Tisha B'Av. And in part inspired by the fact that many of the contemporaries of the Shoah, whether in Europe or outside of Europe, when they wrote about the Shoah during the 1940s, even after the war, so many of them didn't call it Holocaust, didn't even call it Shoah. They called it the Churban, the destruction. And Raoul Hilberg, as I mentioned, in 1961, titles his book, The Destruction, the Churban of European Jewry, of the European Jews. Using the word korban in a Jewish context, destruction, of course, has connotations of the destruction of the temples. The first temple in 586 BCE and the second temple in 70 CE. No wonder Menachem Begin advocated for making Tisha B'Av, Yom HaShoah in Israel, relating to it as the Korban, another Korban in Jewish life. He did not prevail. He was in the minority of the government in the early 1950s, and instead, the 27th of Nisan was chosen. And this Arch of Titus that shows the Hebrew slaves, the Jewish slaves being brought to Rome. This is in the Roman Forum today. You could still see it today. Carrying the Klei Kodesh, the holy vessels of the temple, the menorah, the trumpets. And you can see Roman soldiers in the background. One is holding up a banner of the Roman legion. This was clearly the inspiration for the first major monument to the Shoah by Natan Rappaport. Natan Rappaport was a Warsaw Jew who was a sculptor. He studied in Paris in the interwar years. And when the Nazis invaded, he fled to the Soviet Union. That's where he survived. In fact, most of the Polish Jews who survived the Nazi onslaught survived because they fled to the Soviet Union. My parents among them. And the Rappaport Monument has one side that's much more famous that I'm not showing here, that shows the ghetto fighters, the ghetto heroes. Very strong, muscular, each one holding a different kind of weapon. But on the reverse side, and both sides appear side by side at Yad Vashem today, copies of the original Rappaport. On the reverse side, which he titled Their Final Journey, you can see that he's done a bas-relief similar to the Arch of Titus, clearly inspired by them. Here you see the Jews carrying the Sefer Torah instead of the vessels of the temple. You could see the Nazi soldiers in the background. The Rappaport Monument was, as I said, the first major monument anywhere in the world to the Shoah. It was dedicated in April 1948, the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, attended by 100,000 people, from what I have read. Numerous dignitaries spoke, including Albert Einstein. Clearly, for Rappaport, this was a korban. This was a destruction. Lord Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth before Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, once said that the response of the Jews to the destruction of the Second Temple was not to build a museum to the temple, but rather to write the Mishnah, to create rabbinic Judaism. We have survived the Chorban Europa, the destruction of European Jewry, 75 or 80 years ago. The loss was not only one of numbers. Almost all of the great Jewish thinkers and leaders and writers of the 20th century came from Central and Eastern Europe. Think about it for a moment. Rav Kook, Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Rav Soloveitchik. They were all from Central and East, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. They were all from Eastern and Central Europe. Think of the great Zionist leaders, Herzl, Ahad Ha'am, Weizmann, Ben Gurion, And I could go on. Almost all of them from Eastern and Central Europe. It was not only a question of the terrible numbers of Jews who were murdered. It was the heartland of Jewish life that was destroyed, the heartland that produced our greatest thinkers, our greatest writers. Every fast day is an opportunity for cheshbon hanefesh. And I'd like to conclude by saying that time will tell if we will recover as a people from our terrible losses. This Tisha B'Av, let us think about what each of us can do to ensure a vibrant Jewish future, not merely a physical survival, but of a Jewish Renaissance. And let the rabbis of the Mishnah, let them be our inspiration. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions if people have questions now. Are any Sonderkommando known to have survived Belzhitz? Is one question. Rudolf Rieder was involved in the burning of the bodies. Sorry, the other one, I think his name was Horowitz, was involved in the burning of the bodies, which was not really the Sonderkommando because they just buried the bodies then. I don't know for sure if Rieder was a member of the Sonderkommando, so I really don't know. How did they dispose of the bodies as fast as they murdered people? It was much easier to put them in mass graves than to burn them. The burning was really the log jam in the process. It took the longest. Chernyakov's diary, I believe, was part of the Onyx Shabbos archives, but perhaps I am mistaken. How did Rieder manage to survive Belzhitz? He managed to escape. I don't know the details of his escape, but he managed to escape before all of the Jewish laborers, slave laborers, were murdered. Any other questions? Once Jews realized it was a death camp, why was there no uprising in Belzhitz? It's a good question. You know, the will to survive is very great. And the Jewish, again, the Jews who are working in the death camp know that on a whim, the Nazis can murder them. If you revolt, your chances of succeeding are not so great. Remember, the Jews didn't have easy access to arms, and for the most part, there weren't military personnel who were there. One of the reasons that in Sobibor, the revolt was so successful was because there was a Russian officer and Russian soldiers and a Dutch naval captain who were imprisoned as Jewish slave laborers there. So throughout most of the Shoah, revolt was actually suppressed by the idea that not only was your chance of survival very small if you tried to revolt, but actually the Nazis would also take mass reprisals against your comrades. And so therefore, people just hoped that they'd be able somehow to get along and not in the end be killed. For example, the Jewish workers at Belzhitz, once they burn the bodies, are sent to Sobibor. And they might have believed that they would work at Sobibor and ultimately be liberated. At that time, the Russian army was already pushing the Germans back. So what the necessary organization and arms and the will to fight and the belief that you could actually succeed, because most of those who escaped did not survive. was necessary in order for it to happen. So it happened in 2 of the 3 camps, but it didn't happen in Belzec. It wasn't only the Sonderkommando, it was the Jewish slave laborers in general. In Auschwitz, in Birkenau, the revolt was run by the Sonderkommando. They were the ones who revolted. The Onyx Shabbos archives were hidden under the ground. They were buried in Warsaw. They were buried in 3 different locations. 2 of them were found after the war, actually quite miraculously, because out of the 60 Onyx Shabbos members, 57 of them were killed. Only 3 survived. And one of them happened to be one of the few people who knew where they were buried. They were buried in metal milk cans and tin boxes. If you've been to the Washington Holocaust Museum or Yad Vashem, you've seen those metal milk cans or tin boxes. The first one was found when an archaeological dig was led by Hirsch Wasser, one of the survivors of the Onyx Shabbos archives, of the Onyx Shabbos group, and he knew where to look. Even then, it was very difficult amidst all the rubble of the ghetto. The second was found by chance in the 1950s. A Polish construction crew was working on taking apart and building a house that had been destroyed, and they came across the second treasure trove of documents, and the third collection has never been found. I don't know if Heydrich had survivors. We do know that some of the SS men had survivors, and some of them walked around with tremendous guilt. Some did not. Weren't the Romanian Jews the next intended victims of Belzec? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I very much appreciate all of you joining me. And I hope this will make our 9 days in Tisha B'Av a little bit more meaningful.